Struggling single dad finds $10,000 in a Christmas gift. What he does next will surprise you. It was a bitterly cold Christmas Eve, and the snow fell softly in the small town where Chris, a single father of two, walked the empty streets. The holidays had never been easy since his wife passed away, but this Christmas felt different. He had no idea that tonight, the season of giving, would show him the true meaning of family and change his life forever. Chris's footsteps crunched in the snow, each one feeling heavier than the last. As he looked around at the decorated houses and festive lights, a deep sadness settled in his chest. Christmas had once been his favorite time of year. It was when he and his wife Sarah would exchange loving glances as they decorated the tree and wrapped presents for Emily and Jake. The air would be filled with laughter and the smell of Sarah's famous Christmas dinner, but those memories now seemed like a lifetime ago. This year, Sarah's absence felt even more acute. Without her, there were no warm embraces or joyful chaos in the house. Only quiet evenings spent trying to make ends meet, and the harsh reality of struggling to provide for his kids. Chris knew they deserved more, but it seemed impossible to make ends meet on his meager mechanic's wages. As Chris walked, he passed the town's Christmas tree in the center square, its lights twinkling brightly, casting a warm glow over the snow. He paused for a moment, looking up at the star atop the tree. He had promised his children that this year would be different, that he would make sure they had a magical Christmas, no matter what. But deep down, he feared he had failed them. This year had been especially difficult. The car repairs were fewer, and the old garage where he worked had just been bought by a new owner who was slashing hours. He hadn't been able to pick up extra shifts, and the bills were mounting. Chris could barely afford to buy food for the week, let alone presents. His kids, Emily and Jake, never complained, but he could see the sadness in their eyes when they looked at the empty tree, knowing their father was trying, but not succeeding, to make Christmas special. "Dad, it's okay," Emily had said a few nights ago, after Chris apologized for not being able to get them a tree topper. "We have everything we need." But Chris knew better. He had seen the sparkle in her eyes when she had opened last year's gifts, the look of pure happiness that only a child could feel. This year, he couldn't even promise her that. As he walked home that evening, a strange feeling washed over him. The cold didn't bother him as much. Something was calling him, drawing him toward the small diner at the end of the block. It was a place he never usually went, mostly because it was too expensive for him. But tonight, something about the diner seemed different. He hesitated, standing at the entrance, wondering if he should just keep walking and go home to face his children. But he pushed open the door, the warmth of the diner enveloping him. Inside there were a few customers scattered around, but it was mostly empty. The owner, a kind woman in her 50s named Carol, waved at him from behind the counter. "Chris, come on in, it's freezing out there," she called out with a smile. He smiled weakly and made his way to a booth by the window. Carol poured him a cup of coffee, and for a few minutes he just sat there, staring at the snow falling outside, his mind racing with thoughts of how to make Christmas work for his children. "Anything special going on this year?" Carol asked, her voice gentle. She had seen Chris struggle over the years but never asked too many questions. She knew how hard it was for him. Chris sighed and shook his head. "Just trying to make it through the night, Carol. Not sure how I'll get them a decent Christmas. It's been a tough year." Silence followed. Carol's expression softened, and she reached into the pocket of her apron. "I've got something for you," she said, pulling out a small envelope. "I've been saving this for a special moment. I think it's time to give it to you." Chris looked at the envelope with confusion. "What is it?" "Just open it," Carol said with a smile. Chris carefully tore open the envelope. Inside, there was a check made out to him for an amount that made his jaw drop. It was more money than he had seen in months, enough to cover the rent, buy presents, and maybe even treat his children to something special. Now, Carol, I don't know what to say, Chris stammered, looking up at her in disbelief. How did you? Carol smiled softly. You've been working hard for years, Chris. You've never asked for anything. You deserve a little Christmas magic. Sometimes, people give back to others in unexpected ways. Tears welled up in Chris's eyes as he looked at the check. For the first time in months, a spark of hope flared within him. This Christmas, maybe things would be different after all. But there was more to come. This act of kindness from Carol would only be the beginning of a Christmas Eve that would change Chris's life and his understanding of what family really meant. As he walked back through the snow, clutching the check, he couldn't help but wonder, what else could happen tonight? This Christmas was shaping up to be the one he would never forget. As Chris walked through the quiet, snow-dusted town square, his eyes scanned the familiar surroundings. The towering Christmas tree in the center, the bustling cafe on the corner, everything was as it had always been. But tonight, something was different. A shop, nestled between two large buildings, caught his attention. Its windows glowed with a golden warmth, radiating a sense of comfort and peace that felt almost otherworldly. Chris was certain he had never noticed it before. He paused, glancing up at the small, inviting sign above the door. The words were written in elegant script, "The Christmas Wish Shop." For a brief moment he considered walking past. He had no money to spend, no reason to be here, but something pulled him in, a feeling he couldn't explain. Before he could change his mind, Chris found himself pushing open the door. The warmth inside enveloped him like a comforting embrace. The air smelled of cinnamon, pine, and a hint of freshly baked cookies. Shelves were lined with beautifully wrapped gifts, each one more dazzling than the next. Soft Christmas music played in the background, and for a moment, Chris felt like he had stepped into another world, a place where worries melted away and joy filled every corner. Behind the counter stood an elderly woman with silver hair that framed her kind, weathered face. Her eyes twinkled as if she carried the spirit of Christmas within her. She smiled warmly as she noticed Chris enter, as though she had been expecting him. "Looking for something special?" she asked, her voice gentle and inviting. Chris shifted uncomfortably, the weight of his troubles still heavy on his shoulders. "Just browsing," he mumbled, feeling slightly out of place. But even as he spoke, his gaze was drawn to a small box sitting on a nearby shelf, unlike the other extravagant gifts around it. The box was simple, wrapped in shimmering red paper with a plain white tag that read, "To someone in need." Something about it intrigued him. He reached out and gently picked it up, turning it over in his hands. "What is this?" he asked, glancing back at the woman. Her smile deepened, and she stepped closer, her eyes gleaming with something unspoken. "That gift is not for sale," she explained softly. "It's meant for someone who truly needs it. No payment is required, just trust in the spirit of Christmas." Chris furrowed his brow, unsure of what to make of her words. "But how will I know if it's meant for me?" he asked, still holding the small box carefully. The woman's eyes seemed to twinkle even more. "You'll know," she said simply. "Sometimes the things we need most aren't the ones we seek. Christmas has a way of bringing them to us when we least expect it." Chris stood there for a moment, uncertain. The practical side of him told him to leave the shop, to dismiss the strange encounter. But another part of him, the part that still believed in the magic of Christmas, no matter how hard life had been, urged him to accept the gift. After a moment of hesitation, he nodded, thanking the woman. She watched with a knowing smile as he placed the small box in his coat pocket and stepped back out into the cold night. As he walked through the snow-covered streets toward home, the wind nipping at his face, Chris couldn't shake the strange feeling that had settled over him. The box was light in his pocket, but it carried with it a sense of hope that he hadn't felt in a long time. For the first time that night, he allowed himself to imagine what might be inside. A possibility, a chance at something more than the struggle he had known for so long. When he arrived home, the small, modest apartment was dimly lit, with only the glow of the Christmas tree's twinkling lights illuminating the room. Emily and Jake were already asleep, bundled up on the couch, waiting for him to come home. The tree was sparsely decorated, its base bare, except for a few small gifts Chris had managed to buy with the little money he had left. Chris took off his coat and sat down, pulling the small red box from his pocket. He stared at it for a long moment, his heart pounding softly in his chest. Could this really be for me? He wondered. Yes. With a deep breath, he carefully unwrapped the shimmering paper. Inside the box was something simple, yet profound. A small key and a note. The note, written in delicate handwriting, read, "For the door you've yet to open, trust in the kindness of strangers, and you will find what you need." Chris stared at the key, confusion swirling in his mind. What door? What did this mean? He stood up and glanced around his tiny apartment, but nothing seemed out of place. The mystery only deepened. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. Chris's heart raced as he crossed the room and opened it, expecting perhaps a neighbor or someone from the building. Instead, standing in the dimly lit hallway, was a man he didn't recognize. He was tall, dressed in a long coat, and he carried a folder under his arm. "Are you Chris?" the man asked, his voice kind but serious. "Yes," Chris replied, unsure of what was happening. The man smiled faintly and handed him the folder. "This is for you. It's from someone who wishes to remain anonymous, but they wanted to make sure you got it tonight." Chris took the folder, confused. The man nodded once and then disappeared into the night, leaving Chris standing in his doorway, stunned. "Ah!" Slowly, Chris opened the folder. Inside were documents, and as he read through them, his eyes widened. The papers detailed the ownership of a small house, paid in full, deeded to him, a home, a real home for him and his children, somewhere they could start fresh. His hands shook as he turned to the last page, and there, clipped to the final document, was a picture of the house with an address scribbled beneath it. Chris's mind raced. The key in the box. It was for this house. Tears filled his eyes as the weight of it all sank in. He had been given the one thing he had always wanted but never believed he could have. Security. A place for his family to truly call home. As he sank onto the couch, overcome with emotion, Chris looked at his sleeping children and whispered, "Merry Christmas." The magic of the night had worked in ways he never could have imagined. Later that night, once his children were tucked in bed, their soft, rhythmic breathing filling the small apartment, Chris sat alone at the kitchen table. The air was still, save for the occasional crackle from the old heater. In front of him lay the small, mysterious gift box he had brought home from the shop earlier. His heart pounded as he reached for it, his fingers trembling. He hadn't expected anything remarkable inside, perhaps a token of kindness, something symbolic, but what he found made his breath catch in his throat. Carefully unwrapping the shimmering red paper, Chris uncovered a plain white envelope. Inside, his eyes widened in disbelief. Crisp $100 bills, more money than he had ever seen in one place. $10,000 in cash. His fingers fumbled as he counted it, over and over, just to be sure. It was real. His mind raced with possibilities. Rent for months, presents for his children, groceries, maybe even saving enough to start fresh. For a brief moment, Chris felt the weight of his burdens lift. This money could change everything. It was a gift, an answer to all the quiet prayers he had whispered on those long nights, wondering how he would keep his family afloat. Relief surged through him, followed closely by disbelief. Who had done this? Why him? As these thoughts swirled in his head, he noticed something else in the envelope. A small, folded piece of paper tucked beneath the bills. He unfolded the note. The words, simple yet profound. You now have the means to change your life, but if you choose to return to the shop before midnight, the amount will double. Under one condition, you must give the entire sum to someone who needs it more than you do. Chris read the note twice, then a third time, his mind reeling. Return the money before midnight, and it would double. But none of it would be his. He would have to give it all away. He stared at the note, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on him like a storm cloud. $10,000 was a fortune, more than enough to solve so many of his problems. He could pay off his overdue rent, buy his children the Christmas they deserved, and still have enough left to start saving for a better future. It was the answer he had been praying for. But the offer to double the amount was tantalizing too. $20,000. An unimaginable sum. The idea of giving that much to someone in greater need stirred something deep inside him. But was it possible? Did he even know someone who needed the money more than he did? And could he really walk away from such a life-changing gift for the sake of another? His hands clenched into fists as he tried to think clearly. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, its rhythmic beat only adding to the tension. Midnight was approaching, and he had only a short time to make his choice. The thought of giving up the money gnawed at him. He had been through so much. Years of struggling, working long hours at the garage, barely scraping by. Didn't he deserve this? Didn't his children? Emily and Jake had never known a Christmas that wasn't filled with compromise. There were always fewer presents under the tree, always one or two decorations they couldn't afford. Every holiday was a reminder of what they had lost and what Chris couldn't provide. And now, after all that, he had a chance to change everything. But that second part of the note haunted him. If he returned the money, someone else could benefit from it in ways that went beyond what he had imagined for himself. Who was out there, struggling like he was? Who could be on the brink of losing everything? Chris stood up, pacing around the kitchen. His eyes fell on the small Christmas tree in the corner of the living room. The lights flickered faintly, casting a soft glow over his children's sleeping faces. They looked so peaceful, so unaware of the hardships their father was battling. Chris felt a lump form in his throat as he watched them. He wanted more for them, so much more, but he also wanted to teach them something important, something about the spirit of giving that went beyond material things. Time was slipping away. He checked the clock again. 11:30 p.m. He had less than 30 minutes to decide. Chris grabbed his coat and stuffed the envelope back into his pocket, the money still inside. He wasn't sure what he would do, but he couldn't sit at the table any longer. He had to go back to the shop. Maybe once he was there, the right choice would become clear. The streets were quiet as Chris hurried through the snow, his breath visible in the cold night air. The town square was still aglow with Christmas lights, but the shop ahead looked darker than it had before. The warmth he had felt earlier seemed to have faded, replaced by an eerie stillness. But the door was still there, and inside was the old woman who had given him the box. Chris hesitated at the entrance, his heart pounding. Was this a trick? Some kind of test? He didn't know, but something inside urged him forward. He stepped into the shop, the bell above the door chiming softly. The woman behind the counter looked up, her kind eyes meeting his. She didn't seem surprised to see him. "I see you've returned," she said, her voice gentle but knowing. Chris nodded, his throat dry. I don't know what to do," he admitted. "This money, it could change my life, but the note..." The woman smiled softly. "You've been given a choice, Chris. A rare one. The money in your pocket can ease your burdens, yes. But sometimes the greatest gift is not what we receive, but what we give." Chris stared at her, the weight of her words sinking in. The idea of walking away from the money felt impossible, but deep down, he knew there was truth in what she said. He thought of the countless others out there, struggling like him, maybe even worse. What if this money could save someone else? What if this was his chance to truly make a difference, not just for his family, but for someone else? The clock on the wall ticked closer to midnight. Chris took a deep breath, his hands trembling as he pulled the envelope from his pocket. "I'll do it," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'll give it away." The man began to speak. The old woman's smile widened, her eyes shining with approval. "Then you've made the right choice." As the clock struck midnight, the warmth in the shop seemed to return, filling the room with a sense of peace. Chris felt lighter, as though a burden he hadn't realized he was carrying had been lifted. And as he left the shop, empty-handed but with a full heart, he knew that this Christmas, something far more precious than money had been given to him, the true spirit of the season. By 11:45 p.m., Chris found himself pacing relentlessly around the house, the weight of the note in one hand and the thick envelope of money in the other. His mind was in turmoil. The faint sound of his children's breathing from their bedroom reminded him of their innocence, unaware of the life-changing decision that lay before him. He glanced over at the small Christmas tree, its modest lights flickering softly, casting a warm glow over the few gifts he had managed to scrape together. Each one represented sacrifice. A toy for Emily, a book for Jake, things he had carefully budgeted for, months of saving pennies just to bring a little joy into their lives. But now, sitting at his kitchen table with a fortune in his hands, the gravity of the situation pulled at him. This money could change everything. For the first time in years, his children wouldn't have to go without. The thought of being able to give them new clothes, better food, even a real vacation, it was overwhelming. He imagined them playing in the sun, laughing, carefree. For the first time since their mother had passed, they'd forgotten what it was like to have abundance, and so had he. But as powerful as that vision was, there was something else that tugged at his heart. A quiet voice that refused to be ignored, someone in greater need. The words from the note echoed in his mind, growing louder with each passing minute. He slumped into a chair and let out a long sigh, rubbing his face with his free hand. Could he really turn his back on this opportunity for the sake of someone else who could possibly need it more than his family? Images of his neighbors began to flash through his mind. The old man down the street, whose heating had been shut off. The single mother at the grocery store, who always seemed to be counting every penny. The family in the small house by the corner that always had dark windows. Chris wasn't the only one struggling. The entire town seemed weighed down by hard times. But this was his chance. His children had been through so much already. He deserved this. Didn't he? As the minutes ticked by, he glanced nervously at the clock. 11:50 p.m. In 10 minutes, the window of opportunity would close forever. His heartbeat quickened, and his palms grew sweaty. The temptation to keep the money burned inside him like a fire, but the thought of doubling it and helping someone else, there was a strange allure to that as well. He looked down at the envelope again, fingers tightening around it, feeling the edges of the bills through the paper. It's a miracle, he thought. A gift. But if he didn't take this second chance, would he always wonder if he had made the wrong choice? If this money could provide comfort for someone else, someone suffering in ways he couldn't even imagine, wasn't it worth giving it up? Chris stood abruptly, the chair scraping across the floor. His decision had been made, even if it tore at his heart. He had to go back. He had to at least try to find out what this mysterious shopkeeper meant. Maybe the right thing was to give it away, to change someone else's life instead of just his own. There was still time. Without wasting another second, he grabbed his coat, barely stopping to glance at the tree one last time. His heart ached, knowing how much his kids deserved a brighter Christmas. But deep down, he knew they deserved something even greater. The lesson that Christmas was about more than presents under a tree. He stepped out into the biting cold, pulling his collar up against the wind. The snow crunched beneath his boots as he hurried through the quiet, empty streets. His breath clouded in the icy air, his footsteps the only sound in the stillness of the night. The town square came into view, illuminated by twinkling lights and festive decorations. But the shop, that strange, magical shop, was barely visible between the other buildings. It seemed even smaller now, almost as if it didn't want to be found. Chris hurried toward it, the thought of the clock ticking relentlessly in his mind. With 5 minutes to spare, he reached the shop's door, hesitating for only a moment before pushing it open. The bell above the door chimed softly, just like before, and the warmth of the place wrapped around him like a comforting blanket. The shop looked exactly the same, shelves lined with beautiful gifts, the air filled with the scent of cinnamon and pine. Behind the counter stood the old woman, her kind eyes meeting his, as if she had been expecting him all along. She didn't say anything right away, just smiled at him knowingly. "I came back," Chris stammered, still catching his breath from the run. The note. It said, if I returned before midnight." The woman's smile deepened, her eyes sparkling with understanding. "Yes, you've returned," she said softly. "And you've made your decision." Chris nodded, swallowing hard. "I want to help someone who needs it. More than I do." The old woman stepped out from behind the counter, her presence calming yet powerful. She reached out and gently took the envelope from his hand. "You've made a difficult choice, Chris, but sometimes the hardest choices are the ones that matter the most." Chris felt a strange sense of peace wash over him. He hadn't expected this feeling of rightness. It wasn't about the money anymore. It was about something bigger, something deeper. The woman handed him a second envelope. "Take this," she said. "You'll know who needs it when the time comes." Chris looked down at the envelope in his hand, identical to the one he had given her, and a deep sense of gratitude welled up inside him. He had done the right thing, even if it meant walking away from the security he had longed for. Somehow, he knew that everything would be okay. But as he turned to leave, the woman's voice followed him. "Merry Christmas, Chris. You've given more than you'll ever know." With a final glance at the shop, Chris stepped back out into the snow, the town square quiet and still under the blanket of white. The air felt different now, lighter, as if the world itself was brighter. He didn't know what the future held, but as he walked home, the envelope clutched in his hand, he knew one thing for sure. This Christmas would be one they would never forget. When Chris reached the spot where the shop had been, his breath caught in his throat. The shop, the magical, cozy shop, was gone. Instead, he was staring at an empty, snow-covered lot, as if the shop had never existed at all. No lights, no door, no warm glow. His mind reeled. Had it all been some kind of illusion, a trick of his desperate imagination? Chris looked down at the envelope in his hand, suddenly unsure if the money inside was real or if it would vanish just like the shop. His heart raced as doubt flooded in. Was this all a dream? He needed to check. He had to know. Chris tore open the envelope, his breath puffing in the cold air. The money was still there, thick and undeniable, the crisp bills seeming to almost mock his confusion. He could feel the weight of them in his hand, but now, more than ever, they felt unreal. Dejected, Chris turned to leave, the strange encounter leaving a hollowness in his chest. As he trudged through the square, his boots crunching against the snow, something caught his eye. A small, hunched figure sitting on a bench just a few feet away. It was a woman, wrapped in a tattered coat far too thin for the biting cold. Beside her was a little boy, no more than 3 years old, bundled tightly in a worn-out blanket. His small face peeked out, red from the chill, and his eyes blinked wearily, fighting to stay awake. The woman's arms were wrapped around him protectively, but even from where Chris stood, he could see her shivering. His footsteps slowed as he watched them, his heart clenching painfully. The desperation etched in her face was unmistakable. Her lips were cracked and her cheeks flushed from the cold. She looked up at him with eyes that spoke volumes, eyes filled with exhaustion, fear, and something deeper. Helplessness. "Please," she whispered, her voice trembling and raw. "We have nowhere to go." Chris stopped dead in his tracks. The weight of her words hit him harder than the cold air around him. For a moment, everything else faded. The strange shop, the magical gift, his confusion about the money. All that mattered was this woman and her child, sitting alone in the freezing night, without a home, without hope. He glanced down at the envelope once again, now feeling the significance of it more than ever. This was why I was given this, he realized. The note had said he would know when the time came, and now, standing in front of this shivering mother and her son, the choice was clearer than anything. He didn't hesitate. With gentle resolve, he knelt down beside them, the cold seeping through his knees as he held out the envelope. "Here," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Take this." The woman stared at him, her eyes wide with disbelief. Her hands shook as she reached for the envelope, as if afraid it would disappear, like a dream if she touched it. When her fingers finally grasped it, she clutched it tightly to her chest, her eyes filling with tears. Her lips quivered, but no words came. She was too overwhelmed to speak. Chris smiled at her gently. "Merry Christmas," he said, his voice thick with emotion. He wanted to say more, to reassure her that things would get better, but in that moment, the words didn't seem necessary. The look in her eyes, the silent gratitude and relief, said more than words ever could. Tears streamed down the woman's face as she looked down at her son, who gazed up at Chris with wide, curious eyes. She mouthed something, a thank you perhaps, but the words were lost in her sobs of gratitude. She pulled her little boy closer, holding him as if she never wanted to let him go. Chris stood up, his own emotions swirling inside him. He had just given away everything. The money that could have changed his life, his children's lives, and yet, for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel empty. He felt lighter. A strange warmth filled his chest, more powerful than the money ever could. As he turned to walk away, the snow continued to fall softly around them, the town square peaceful and quiet. Chris didn't need to look back to know that he had done the right thing. The old woman's words echoed in his mind, and he realized now what she meant, that the hardest choices often lead to the greatest rewards. And though he wasn't sure what his own reward would be, he knew this: tonight, on Christmas Eve, he had given a stranger the greatest gift of all, hope. When Chris finally reached home, he opened the door quietly, careful not to wake his children. The modest gifts still sat under the tree, the soft glow of the lights casting a peaceful ambience over the room. As he stood there, watching the flickering lights, a sense of peace settled over him. He didn't know what the future held or how he would manage without the money, but somehow he knew they would be okay. He had given his children something far more important than presents this Christmas. He had shown them the true meaning of giving. And as he lay down to sleep that night, Chris felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. The kind of hope that made everything seem possible, even in the darkest of times. This Christmas, it wasn't the gifts under the tree that mattered. It was the gift of kindness, of sacrifice, and of believing that sometimes the best thing you can do is give, even when it seems like you have nothing left to give. The next morning, Chris awoke with a lightness in his chest that he hadn't felt in years. Despite having given away the mysterious money the night before, a deep sense of peace and fulfillment settled over him. As he sat at the small kitchen table, watching Emily and Jake excitedly tear into their modest Christmas presents, his heart swelled. Their joy wasn't in the expensive toys or gadgets they'd been dreaming of, but in the simple act of sharing the morning together, wrapped in love and warmth. The simple gifts, a few books, a toy car for Jake, and a scarf for Emily, were enough. Chris smiled as they laughed, the room filled with the kind of happiness that couldn't be bought. And though the night before had left him with nothing in his pocket, he felt richer than ever. He had done the right thing. He had chosen to give, to help someone in need, even when his own life was far from easy. Later that day, as the morning festivities wound down and the house fell quiet, Chris heard a sudden knock on the door. He furrowed his brow, puzzled. They weren't expecting anyone. With a small sigh, he rose from the couch and made his way to the front door, wondering who it could be. When he opened the door, there was no one there, just the quiet of the snowy afternoon. But something caught his eye. Pinned to the door was an envelope. His heart raced, a familiar feeling of disbelief washing over him. He carefully unpinned it, and as he opened the envelope, a single check fluttered out and into his hands. Chris stared down at the check, his eyes widening as the amount printed on it registered. $50,000. His breath caught in his throat. $50,000. It was more than he had ever dreamed of. His hands trembled as he reached for the note tucked inside the envelope, unfolding it slowly, his heart pounding in his ears. The note was written in the same elegant handwriting as the one he had found in the gift box the night before. Kindness is the true gift of Christmas. You passed the test. Chris's eyes widened, and he read on, barely able to believe what he was seeing. The woman you helped last night is an heiress in disguise, searching for those with the heart to give even when they have little. Your generosity has been rewarded beyond your imagination. Merry Christmas. His legs felt weak beneath him, and he leaned against the doorframe, trying to process what had just happened. An heiress? The woman on the bench with the child. It hadn't been an ordinary encounter. She hadn't been in need at all, but instead, she had been looking for people with the heart to give, even when they had nothing to spare. Chris stood in the doorway, stunned. He had passed some kind of test, one he hadn't even known he was taking. His act of compassion, his willingness to sacrifice for someone he thought was in desperate need, had come back to him in a way he never could have imagined. It wasn't just the money, though that would change his life in ways he hadn't yet begun to fathom. It was the knowledge that, even when tested, he had chosen the right path. He had chosen kindness. As he stepped back into the house, still gripping the check and note, his mind swirled with emotions. This money, $50,000, was enough to change everything. His children could have the security he had always dreamed of giving them. They could move out of the tiny, cramped apartment and into a proper home. His debts would be wiped clean, and he could start fresh without the constant worry that had followed him every day since his wife's passing. But more than that, Chris felt something deeper. This Christmas, he had been reminded of something he had lost along the way: hope. Not just for himself, but for others. His heart had been weighed down by his struggles for so long, he hadn't realized how much he needed to believe in the goodness of people again. Last night's encounter had shown him that sometimes the most important gifts aren't wrapped in bright paper or tied with ribbons. Sometimes the greatest gifts are those that remind us of our capacity to love, to give, and to choose what's right, even when the stakes are high. He looked over at his children, who were playing happily with their new toys in the living room. They didn't know yet what had happened, but they didn't need to. In time, they would understand what their father had done, how he had chosen to give when he had little, and how that choice had come back to them in ways they could never have expected. Chris walked over to the couch, sat down, and smiled to himself. This Christmas, he had been given more than he had ever hoped for. Not just the money, but the reassurance that, despite the hardships he had faced, he had never lost sight of the things that truly mattered: kindness, compassion, the belief that, no matter how difficult life became, there was always room to help others. Kindness! Kindness, Chris said. He had passed the test. And in doing so, he had not only changed his own life, but had also been reminded of the true spirit of Christmas. A spirit that, he now knew, lived in him and in his children. The same candles are here, he told his sons. The world is Christ's kingdom, and the souls of all people are part of that kingdom. And as the snow fell gently outside, Chris's heart swelled with gratitude, knowing that this Christmas, the gift he had received wasn't just about the money. It was the knowledge that love, kindness, and generosity were the greatest treasures of all.